psychedelics in California. Many people, many years, but Bruce Eisner is one of the foundation psychedelics on many. California. In California, we see computers, and some people see drugs. Better, psychedelics. A person who has wandered in both worlds and actually has been very active in both worlds is Bruce Eisner. A man who started one of the first psychological software collections and businesses called mindware, but who also has been very active in research on substances like MDMA, also known as ecstasy. Welcome, Bruce. Here in, where are we?
We're in Santa Cruz, California.
And although it's winter, it's very nice weather, isn't it?
Well, yeah, we're here. This is called fall spring in California. We're in Santa Cruz. We're on a state beach called Natural Bridges Beach. And in January, occasionally we'll have days that it almost seems like spring. The only thing is that the sun goes down a little bit quicker.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we don't notice much of the rain that has brought so much trouble on California this winter.
Oh, well, yeah. You picked a good day to come. Yeah, you certainly did. It's a beautiful day.
Bruce, one of the words that there's two words that spring up in your work. One is mindware, or the word mind, and the other one is island.
Island, right.
How do you come to the word island?
Well, Island Foundation, which was previously known as Island Group, actually comes from the book by Aldous Huxley, Island. And it was the last novel that Aldous Huxley, who's of course noted for his Doors of Perception and his early interest in psychedelics, and also for his book Brave New World. And now, Huxley in the 30s had written Brave New World, where he had taken all of these new ideas of science and drawn what is called a dystopia, an authoritarian future world. And during the rest of his life, as he progressed and entered into the world of Eastern philosophies and psychedelics, and also studied widely in a number of different areas, anthropology and all the various areas.
Yes,
I wanted to distill a way that we could live together based on the psychedelic vision. And so his last project before he died was Island. And now I had put on a conference here back when I was an undergraduate in 1977, where I brought Albert Hofmann from Switzerland to his first public talk in the United States.
Albert Hofmann was the guy who invented or found LSD.
That's correct, yeah. And I had met Albert the year before in Basel, and I invited him here to California, and we had a very large conference in which everybody who had been involved in the counterculture of the 60s, all the researchers in psychedelics, even the beatniks like Allen Ginsberg and people like that were here. And you're talking about people like Ram Dass, yeah.
Tim Leary, Terence at the time?
Terence was not at the first one. He was very undergrad at that time. He came to our second conference, but not that one. And we also had, it was the first reunion between, say, Ralph Metzner, Leary, and Ram Dass since the 60s. Since
the famous three professors from
Harvard University,
who did the first research on LSD for treating people for alcoholism and other problems.
Yeah, and even prisoners. And in any event, they'd also done they were the people who were almost responsible for the psychedelic revolution. They had started this commune called Millbrook, which was an experimental community in psychedelic lifestyle. And in any event, we had researchers, Oscar Janiger from L.A., who'd been involved in the 50s scene, and all kinds of people arrived. And I was just an undergraduate student, but I had been working with Peter Stafford and his girlfriend Lynn Francis, and we invited all these people, and they all showed up. And we had one big event, but it was very, very much work for me to put this together. These conferences are a great deal of work, and as a student, I had to organize it as a student organization thing because the faculty wouldn't approve it as a large conference. And by the end of the last day, I was invited to a special brunch at the La Chamalier, which was a French restaurant here in town, and I decided not to come. Instead, I took this elixir of mushrooms that this friend of mine had brewed up, and we went out to the beach, and I had just finished reading Huxley's Island, and also Leary's book, Intelligence Agents. And in Intelligence Agents, he talks about how consciousness on the planet moves from east to west. And so as you go from India to Europe to to California, consciousness evolves forward. And I was looking westward out to the into the Pacific, and I said, "Where can we go but to an island?" And at the same time, I had been involved in the '60s hippie movement, and in those days, we thought that the revolution was going to happen any day, And then when it didn't happen in the '70s, and Nixon came along, we were a little bit disillusioned. But I said, "Well, I'm going to do something, that's going to be a life's work," and that was Island. And I actually didn't. We had ongoing series of psychedelic organizations here in Santa Cruz, the one that put on the conference, and we did subsequent conferences here and lectures and events. In fact, the university wants to do an archive of how the University of California, Santa Cruz was a place that was responsible for psychedelic history. It's how Marty Lee opens his book, Acid Dreams. It opens up at this conference, where there's 4,000 people all packed around this small auditorium waiting to see this Dr. Albert Hoffman. Well, anyway, I had this idea for this conference, but I ended up in graduate school and so forth. And finally, about 1990, I'd started a company, Mindware, the Mindware catalog in 1988, and in the midst of it all, I said, well, I'm going to start this island group, and we began a series of meetings, salons at my house, and we had all on various topics, wide-ranging topics. We had Nick Herbert, who's noted for as quantum
physics
and faster than light, book Faster Than Light, and
he's into tantra physics these days.
Tantra physics, yeah, and Nick was part of the group, and Elizabeth Gipps, who wrote Sex, Sacraments, and Psychedelics in the 1960s, was involved, and we had Robert Anton Wilson, who lives here in the community, come out and give talks, and what it was a salon where we would educate each other about a variety of different new topics, and ancient topics too, shamanism and so forth. We had a shamanic ritual that was led by a woman, all sorts of things, and this would happen at my house. And then in 1991, we organized the Bridge Conference, linking the past, present, and future of psychedelics at Stanford University, which was a very big success. And then we participated with Rick Doblin from MAPS and Normal in putting together the 1993 Bicycle Day conference here.
Bicycle was when it was remembered on the 14th or the 16th, depending on your historic vision, when LSD was discovered by Albert Hoffman, and he took a bike ride. Yeah. Well, he took the stuff, didn't know what was going to happen, went on the bike, and since then it's called Bicycle Day.
Well, yeah, we actually got into a trademark dispute about that. Somebody claimed that they had a trademark on Bicycle Day. But actually, Parade Magazine was here to do a story about LSD, and we were going to have a bicycle parade, strangely enough, for the cover of Parade Magazine, but it rained all that day. So there were a few hardy souls who ventured forth on their bicycles down Pacific Avenue here. Yeah. And so we did a number of events, and we published a newsletter which has evolved into a magazine called Psychedelic Island Views, which we publish on a biannual basis. Our last issue was dedicated, of course, to the passing of Dr. Timothy Leary, who I was very close with.
Yeah. Well, the 50-year anniversary we also did in Amsterdam, and we had about 100 people, and they took the Magic Brew.
Yeah.
And at the supreme peak of the party, we decided to call Leary, which we had sent one of these devices so we could see him, but he never got it to work or whatever. Anyway, he was on the phone, and the general remark that we all cooked up together was, in Amsterdam, every day is Bicycle Day.
I think he told me, he emailed me that. I remember that. Yeah.
And the thing is, if you don't believe it, come look for yourself.
That's right. I remember he emailed me that. Yeah, he was going to come to our Bicycle Day, but he was there with, I believe that there was a wedding of Yoko Ono, or I think he was going with Yoko Ono to a wedding that day, so he couldn't come out. But we had quite a group of interesting people. We had Laura Huxley here and Alexander Shulgin, of course, who wrote Pikal, and it was quite a good gathering. And so we've done this, and recently we've incorporated it as a nonprofit foundation, and we have a worldwide website, www.island.org, and we have resources. What we're trying to do is link the psychedelic community around the world. We have a slogan that goes, meet locally, link globally. And so people get together in small groups, face to face, and talk about their experiences and about forming experimental community, about new ideas, about ancient ideas and how we can use them, and also to link together these small groups. I mean, there's people all over the world that email me. I mean, we get emails from Ukraine and New Zealand, everywhere. People saying that they and people in the middle of the Midwest, the cultural desert, that they don't know anybody who even talks to them about psychedelics, and they can talk to us and link to us. So that's the idea, is to be a network, and we work with all the other groups, the groups that are the Drug Reform Policy, Drug Policy Committee, and
Are you working with the people that are, say, involved in what was it, Proposition 215, the thing that kind of made medical use of marijuana in this state?
Well, not officially as Island, because Island is non-political. Island is we believe in what we want to do is form an experimental community and use it as a meme to spread psychedelic culture. We don't believe in doing it in the United States necessarily, because we feel that the local politics is a bit too oppressive here. Although there may be some experiments here locally, we feel that ultimately we have to go somewhere else to do it. But myself personally, I am on a political action committee to put a ballot initiative on the 1998 ballot, very similar to the one that just passed in Arizona. And I support that, to use psychedelics for medical use. However, myself personally, my belief is that drugs should be completely taken away from the domain of the criminal system, and that we were talking earlier before the cameras turned on about why we get high. Yeah. My essay, Why We Get High. I feel ultimately that the uses of psychedelics extend far beyond medical use. They go into areas of spiritual and self-actualization, creativity, and even recreation, in a different way of thinking about the word recreation. In fact, that was I had been working on this essay for Island Views, and I did it as a two-part essay because I like to have a reader go from one issue to the next. So I had started writing this essay, Why We Get High, and I wrote the first part of it. It was mainly about how getting high is moving from ego to the id, in the terms of Freud, how we go from pure structured physical
self-defense
to total imagination and total fantasy and total play, and that a number of technologies, both psychedelic and non-psychedelic, all bear on this. So I gave the example of virtual reality, nanotechnology, near-death experiences, isolation tanks, all of these things, hypnosis, and all of these things, what happens is that there's a freeing up from the normal perspective to a world where we can recreate completely new worlds. And this so that's where the end of part one was, is going through all these technologies. And I was, well, what do I say in part two? Where would I go from here? And so I took refuge. I cited how the drive to get high, the drive to intoxicate, is a natural, fundamental human impulse. In Ronald Siegel from UCLA, Ronald Siegel MD's book Intoxication, he talks about how the drive to get high is like a fourth drive after hunger, thirst, and sex. We have this drive, and they see it in animals and so forth. But why is it there? What's its evolutionary purpose, in the words of science?
But would you believe that like in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that it would fit into like self-actualization?
That's correct. Yeah, and what I did was then I retreated back to my book. Now, in my book, I had gone through what I called the uses of ecstasy. So there was a chapter on the different effects, the empathetic effects, the effects which we call the inner effects, self-esteem, the all rightness with the universe effects. Entactogen was the word that David Nichols had coined. Entactogen. It means to get in touch with the within.
Yeah, there's also the word entheogen,
Ente-
getting in touch with the God within.
Yeah, and this word entactogen was coined by David Nichols from Purdue, who worked with Sasha Shulgin or Alexander Shulgin on a lot of new drugs, including some new forms of LSD. And he also was the founder of one of the founders of the Hefner Foundation, which is a new foundation looking into research with psychedelics in the mind. And then Ralph Metzner had used the word empathogen, so two of my earlier chapters had dealt with that. But then I said, well, what are the uses of ecstasy? And I started out with the medical uses, because in the early days of use of ecstasy here in the United States, it was spread about by Leo Zeff, the secret chief, who was a member of the Shulgin group, and he had gone all over the country and given it to therapists. And in the early days, it was still legal. It was kept very quiet. And so the medical uses, use of it with treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, any kind of traumatic anxiety, relationships, and these kinds of things were important.
So you're talking about like therapists who give it to their patients or to take it themselves, and together they work on problems.
A lot of times the therapist wouldn't take it with them. They would, but sometimes they would. And I talk about that as well. But then I came up with, okay, well, what are these other uses? Okay, the second use, of course, was creativity. And there had been some early studies that were all informal because there was no, government protocol studies, but people had used it with creative writers to free up their writing. Artists had used it to do paintings and so forth, and so these were the uses in creativity. Then the third use I came up with was what we call self-actualization, and I mentioned Maslow, of course. And these were the uses by exceptional people who were not needed to be healed, but people who had their life together but wanted to go further, wanted to become more, and that's what Maslow talked about, becoming more. So they had their lower needs fulfilled, and they wanted to achieve the transcendent experiences, which is, of course, ecstasy, is named for. I knew the guy who named ecstasy originally.
Who was that?
He was Timothy Leary's drug dealer. I won't mention his name, but he said, well, I probably should have called it empathy, but ecstasy sells better. It was his remark to me. And
it was also called Adam in the early days because of the MDMA.
Yeah,
MDA.
My first chapter of my book is called Introducing Adam. That was right. That's right. And that was. And there was another drug, Eve, that came out, obviously. And the two work very well together.
Because we see there is an enormous amount of drugs. In Pikal, in the forthcoming book, Tikal, Sasha Shulgin describes hundreds of substances that he invented or he expect to be psychoactive.
Yeah. But he only had a few favorites. Adam was one of them, Eve was another. I imagine he has a few up his sleeve that we don't know about yet, but...
that seems to be the latest trend, is looking for, how would you call that, sex drugs, is it, how do you call these...
aphrodisiacs?
Aphrodisiacs.
Yeah. Well, what did Timothy say? He said intelligence is the ultimate aphrodisiac. And a friend of mine wrote a book about aphrodisiacs. It was Dan Joy and John Morgenthaler wrote a book together on aphrodisiacs. They found that there was only one...
These were the writers also of Smart Drugs and Nutrients.
Right. Well, Dan Joy was added there. He also edited the second edition of my book. And old friend of mine, he edited flashbacks, and going to be editing a forthcoming book we're doing called Psychedelics Today, which is based on the collected works in Island Views. And
because it has become not only on paper, but because of your work in the web and using the web and the internet as a communication tools, you have gathered an enormous amount of digital data and digital links in your site.
Oh yeah, when I was working on my link site, I realized that I was writing a book with millions of pages. Instead, an author will write an outline for doing a book, and then of course you'll have 3 or 4 paragraphs about each of your subheads. Instead of having 3 or 4 paragraphs, you link to 5 sites that have thousands of pages. So the amount of information that can be organized through links to other sites is enormous. And as the internet grows, which seems like it's growing exponentially, the amount of information just keeps adding on, and links become links to links,
yeah, but doesn't it get? I mean, this is where you can argue, but between the difference between data and information.
Yeah.
There's a lot of data there, but is it possible for an average, I don't know, high school kid who wants to know about psychedelics and drugs that are on the street that he shares with his friend? Are there easy ways to know about this without going into 20,000 links to scientific?
I got comic books from England that have the Crazy Kids Go to Amsterdam. Have you ever seen that comic book? I'll show it to you after after our talk. But no, I see what the information explosion is true. I mean, there is so much stuff there that people tend to surf. But as Doug Rushkoff in his recent books has talked about, the new generation is they're into channel surfing and into information surfing. They taste information and they absorb it very quickly.
They have MTV minds too.
Yeah, they have MTV minds, and they surf through the net, and they see a little thing there and a little thing there, and they pick at it. And of course, with these search engines that we have now, you can be very pinpoint and very specific and get very accurate information on what you want if you know what you're looking for. Now, for a young person, I think that they take to the computers very quickly. They were born with them the same way that our generation was born with televisions. And so at a very early age, they're learning how to seek out the information they want. And of course, now with these new technologies like intelligence agents, it's funny that Leary called his book Intelligence Agents, because there's actually some new software technology called intelligent agents, which they're now marketing and beginning to market, which seek out exactly the information that you were looking for. And they seek it out while you're not even on the computer. So,
and they bring it back.
And they bring it back to you. You get
desktop delivery.
Right? And I think that's the way of the future. Sure, there's a plethora of information, and people like myself, certainly can't digest it all, but we can link to it, and people can explore what they like, and eventually we'll have ways of being able to filter it so that people can get exactly what they need. And you can get, and even through these database searches, you can get remarkable, pinpoint remarkably what you're looking for. For instance, if you do a search on the term LSD purity, you're only going to pull up 4 or 5 pages. One of them happens to be my old article that I put online from High Times, LSD Purity, which I wrote back in 1977, which was part of the special LSD issue. And recently I got some email from Stanley Osley questioning some of the specifics of my article. But I was one of the first people to talk about LSD purity years before I got into talking about ecstasy. I was always very interested in that subject as well.
Well, what's your personal interest? I mean, do you like the trip? Do you like the effect of psychedelics in your normal life? The expansion there? What is it?
Okay. Yeah, I am of the belief that I'm very much a Huxleyan. I believe that the importance of psychedelics is not the experience itself, but what you do with it. In other words, you have the vision, and you take it back into the world, and you make the world supportive of that vision and consistent with that vision as much as you can. That's one of the chief goals of Island Foundation, is to develop a culture that nurtures and supports the visions that come out of the psychedelic experience. And so we have a world that emphasizes those values that come out of those experiences and allows them to be integrated into the society. Now, I don't believe that myself personally, I may use a psychedelic once a year. I mean, a strong psychedelic. I'm older now. It takes me a while to put all the pieces back together. I like to take a very strong dose when I take it, but I don't like to take it very often. And I feel that if you study the lives of people who've used psychedelics, it's the people who've used them very little who get the most out of them. For instance, Huxley or Albert Hoffman or people like that, they didn't use LSD every weekend. Hoffman probably used psychedelics 16 times, Huxley maybe 12 or 14 times in his whole life, Alan Watts maybe 10 times. But they got an awful lot out of it because they brought it back the vision and expressed it in the world, in their art, in their writing, in social action. in community work, in the way that one regards one's fellow human being.
That brings us to the subject of recreational use. I mean, in the debate that we have at the moment on marijuana in Holland, whatever, yes, there is medical use and there might be therapeutic use, but then there is recreational use. People smoke a little bit of pot here and then tomorrow and all the time. Is it true, for instance, that along these lines that people said there's only 10 or 20 hits of or trips on the MDMA that really are worthwhile, and the rest it becomes a habit?
I think that anything that's repeated too much, any experience that's repeated too much or too often, wears itself out. And so, my advice to people: I certainly don't advocate the use of illegal substances, but if people were to be using them, I certainly would say that using them more infrequently, they will get more out of them. Because, for instance, it's funny, we're here at this beach. I was at we had a Peter Stafford picnic, because Peter Stafford, the Psychedelics Encyclopedia guy, lives here in town. And I was gathered with a group of people smoking some marijuana. And one fellow said to me, I've been taking LSD every day for the last, 50 days, and I have to keep doubling the amount I take each day, and he was up to maybe 7 sheets, and I said, wait a minute, I said, LSD isn't for taking every day, it's for special occasions, and he said, you mean I don't have to take it every day? And I said, no. He said, well, I'll save a lot of money.
Yeah, but there were people like John Lilly who, on ketamine, for years of his life, took a lot.
Well, it's a matter of values. My value is that it's important to be in our normal reality and to work and to live and have fully integrated egos, to be able to accomplish and to provide for our security, for to help other people, to do work in the world. And Lilly, at a certain point in his life, I think he began to value being out there all the time, and he didn't have much concern for this world anymore. But it always goes back to this scene. It was reenacted at 2 conferences, at Rick's conference in 1990 in Berkeley, and at the Bicycle Day conference here. We had an enactment. Ram Dass and Laura Huxley did it there, and we had Frances Huxley from England and Laura Huxley do it there. But it was a scene from her book, This Timeless Moment, in which Laura is guiding Aldous Huxley through an LSD trip, and Huxley had been searching for the clear light. And at a certain point, she's taping everything, and he says, I found it, the clear light, or something to that effect. And then she says yes, and he sits for a while, and he says, the clear light is an ice cube. Now, Laura had been writing this book called You Are Not the Target, which was a book on psychology. And in her nomenclature in that book, an ice cube was a place where you get stuck. He said, the clear light, and then he repeated himself again. He said, the clear light is an ice cube. What's important is love and work in the world. And what he meant by that, I believe, is that once you've been out there, then you have to take that vision back and express it and make it part of everything. In other words, it's like the Zen saying, before enlightenment, the man chops wood and carries water. After enlightenment, he chops wood and carries water. Of course, he chops wood and carries water differently, but he still does it. But
it also sounds very much like a Sufi attitude to say you have to be in the world. You can only be a man of God if you are also a man of the world.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things. I mean, like the Bodhisattva in Buddhism. All of these religions and mystical philosophies talked about this. That there's always the case. I mean, one of the things that people really are afraid of about psychedelics are these casualties that you see sometimes, and there are casualties. There are people who've taken psychedelics who may have had a pre-existing mental disorder, or who took it too much and shook themselves up, and they seem very spaced out and out of touch with the world, and they can't take care of themselves, and they become casualties. And this is not to be encouraged. We want to see a wiser use of these compounds. Certain people should only take them under supervision in medical situations. They could be healing for schizophrenic people or manic depressive disorders or severe neurotics if used in a supportive setting. But if they take them out on the street, then we have casualties, and people point to those people and they say, "Oh, that's what happens when you take LSD." And they forget people like Ram Dass or many famous
some of them will, some will point to Tim and say, he was crazy. Let's talk a little bit about Leary.
About Tim. Well, Tim was my dear close friend, and I loved him very much, and I miss him very greatly because he was a mentor to me. I knew him for 20 years, and Tim, if the word crazy is a self-pejorative. Tim, they use crazy wisdom in Tibetan Buddhism. I think that Tim had a certain crazy wisdom to him, but he certainly wasn't crazy, and he always had his act together. He was not a person who of the streets. He was a man of refinement who enjoyed the good things. He knew famous actors. He knew artists. He had traveled around the world. He was a scholar, a brilliant man, and he was a visionary. I think that when we look back on this millennium, he'll be considered like a Galileo or a Copernicus or a Plato.
Yeah, but at the other side, he was, as I experienced him, and I've known him for about 8 years, and we did lots of things together. There was a Tim at home, who was the psychologist, very wise, sometimes irritated, short-fused. But on the other side, there was this crazy clown who would get coke and get on the stage and rant, and sometimes didn't make much sense.
Oh, he would occasionally be like that. Yeah, I mean, Tim was either on or he was off. When he was on, he was brilliant, and when he was off, he was horrible, and no one would ever believe that he could be brilliant. I'm sure everybody has their days. Tim was an adventurer. He was an explorer, and he was he enjoyed partying. But the thing I liked about him the most is that he always spotlighted other people. He empowered other people. He wanted to clone himself while he was living and empower other people to go on and carry on his work. And he had a prankish side. He always gave me a hard time. He gave me a very bad hard time. And for instance, the interview that I did with him that's published in the Island Views was one of the last interviews that was done with him. It was just, he was very, very sick. He was in terrible pain, and very confused. And on top of it, he wanted to give me a hard time. And the combination with the cryonics people coming in, bringing in their tank, and all of the people that were living in his house at the time, it was chaotic. And a number of times he gave me a hard time.
I never believed he would go for it.
But
for the cryonics.
At the end, he said to me, he said, Bruce, he says, I gave you a hard time my whole life, but I love you, and you're my dear friend. And his heart was so open at the end, that one could never fault him for any of his antics. I mean, some people blame him for the death of all the psychedelic research, but there had to be a Tim Leary. If it wasn't, when I interviewed Lilly back in 1971, it was my first interview when I was a young journalist. I interviewed John Lilly back in 1971, and he said, if Tim hadn't done what he did, I would have done it. Now, can you imagine Lilly doing it and Leary doing it? I mean, Leary did it with style, and he did it with humor, and he did it with theatrics, and there had to be some Tim Leary.
And an enormous amount of books and
incredible amount of books, and and he paid his dues. He was in prison here in the United States for 5.5 years for 2 roaches that were planted on him, 2 marijuana roaches, and he did 5.5 years in prison, and he still kept his sense of humor. Quite remarkable. I mean, this man was hardly ever down, and he was an Irishman, a wild Irishman. And I think that the people who think that he was crazy, there was times when he was wild, but I mean, you have friends that sometimes get a little wild, but other times, I had many scholarly discussions with him that would last for hours on a wide variety of topics, and he would be very focused. It was like in the days when I first met him, I was a young psychology student. He was had been a psychologist at Harvard, and we would have these scholarly discussions on wide-ranging topics. And he was like being in a tennis court with the world's best tennis player. He would throw the ball back in your court so quick, His mind was so quick, you know, and in a very rational, logical, intellectual way. But at the same time, he had the ability to let go and be wild when he wanted to, you know, and he would do it, and he would be off sometimes, and other times he would be right on the money. I mean, I produced a couple of lectures for him. One lecture we did, the last lecture, I picked him up at the airport, and he looked at my car and he said, "Is this a good car?" And I said, "Oh yeah, it's fine," you know. And then on the way driving over Highway 17, the timing belt broke. And he said, floor it, Bruce, floor it." We couldn't floor it, so we pulled over to the side of the road, and he was, you know, he hated driving in cars, and he was in a panic, and I waved down a highway patrolman, and the highway patrolman put him in the back seat, said, "Old timer, be sure to buckle up." You know, I didn't know who he was, you know. And
what was different in LA? When you went out with dinner with Tim, there was all said, "Oh, the doctor," and you know everybody knew him there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We actually got to a Denny's restaurant in Scotts Valley, which is a surrounding community to Santa Cruz, and everybody in the Denny's restaurant knew him. And he ordered a senior Grand Slam breakfast they give to the old timers, along with a glass of white wine. Well, we brought him to the Dream Inn, where we always put him up here. It's a hotel on the right on the ocean, and he sat in the bar all day and he drank. And by the time we got him on stage, he was a mess. You know, I have a videotape of it all, and the people in the audience, all these young people, couldn't relate to him at all. Now, the time before, he was startlingly brilliant, but you know, occasionally he would go off on a little bit of a bender.
If you go down, you know, in 20 years' time, looking back on this century, would you think Leary was a figure of importance?
Yeah, and I believe that Huxley was too. I believe that Huxley Huxley at the end was very disapproving of Leary. You know, he had originally kind of cultivated Leary and Richard Alpert at Harvard when he was at MIT as a visiting professor. And they thought that Leary was very square, him and Humphrey Osmond, when they went and visited them. They thought that he was a square guy and that he would be perfect for psychedelics, you know, because he was doing research. And then, of course, when Leary, you know, got kicked out of Harvard because of Alpert's antics, and they went around and started proselytizing about it, Huxley drew a line and said, "No, don't do that. You know, we don't want it to go to the masses. We want it to be kept for people who are more intellectual and more artistic, and if it's given to the masses too fast,
or even for medical use." But this has been a debate. I was in Heidelberg last year, where Albert Hofmann and others spoke, and there was this group of medical people and professors, and they said, "Yeah, we want to experiment with it." And then some people from the audience said, "Yes, but disco and taking ecstasy is our way of doing a ritual. It's our way of experimenting with the drug, and you shouldn't take that away from us."
Yeah, well, that was it's interesting because we had been, you know, we've wandered around a bit here in this interview, and I was talking about the why we get high, and so how did I end it all? Well, you know, I get to my book had 4 different uses. So we had the self-actualization. The last use was recreational. So I went back to an essay that my good friend Peter Stafford had written in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs called "The Recreational Use of LSD." And in there, he coins the word, he uses the word recreational, but he doesn't explain what it means. So I said, well, recreational kind of goes to the basic theory that a lot of people have about psychedelics, in the sense that it allows one to recreate oneself. And now, how does it do that? Because it allows people who are stuck, who are adults, to begin to play, to become like children again, to start doing new things. Now, human beings, we're called Homo sapiens, but one of my teachers, my biology professors, Ralph Berger, was fond of saying that we better be called Homo ludens, which means playful man, rather than Homo sapiens, thinking man, because humans play much longer than any other species. You know, look at your cats or dogs or whatever. They play for a little while and then they become adults. But humans play for years. You know, we could argue they play for 30 years now. Maybe, you know, 50 years ago they played for 18 years or 20 years, but they play for a long time. And in that play, they learn new behaviors and new things. And that's how we re-imprint. We imprint during the time when we're playing, when we're experimenting in our behaviors and our ways of seeing the world. And so the ultimate core usefulness of psychedelics is in the play, and it comes down to, like, even you could look at it in a cosmological sense, the way that Alan Watts looked at it. Alan Watts said that he said, well, everybody always asks why. What is the purpose of the universe? You know, why are we here? Well, the Indians say it's Maya, play. You know, so it's a play, and the recreational, the recreating of the individual comes out of experimenting with new behaviors and new things, and so ultimately, psychedelics should not be confined to medical use or even self-actualization and spiritual use, because that sounds like an ivory tower, you know. Psychedelics are used in people's homes, in their living rooms, out on the beach. They're used in the woods. They're used in raves. They're used in between couples and intimate lovemaking. These are the places where they're used in the world. That's where, and ultimately, the medical use is just one of a number of uses of these things, and I think that in a way, for instance, there are different strategies that people who are interested in psychedelics hope to have them decriminalized, and one of them is to emphasize their medical use. But I don't think that for a moment that many of the people who emphasize marijuana for medical use would confine it to that. I think that they like to smoke it and get high and have fun, you know, and the same could be true of ecstasy. I mean, you know, certainly it could be used for trauma or for couples therapy, you know, but it can be used informally for couples therapy. It could be used for two people to become deeper with each other. It could be used to go out and have a great time, to take what Peter Stafford called a mini vacation from the world of stress, of business, and so forth. LSD can be used as a recreational thing, in the sense that it allows one to completely rearrange all of the stultified and, you know, frozen up things about one's personality, so one can, you know, feel liberated and feel happy and pleasure, you know, and not, you know, we don't need to feel that pleasure is a bad thing. Pleasure is a thing that we're all, you know, here for, you know, so.
Okay. Bruce Eisner on psychedelics. Well, definitely your view of an island is not an isolated island. It's an island that's full with people and full of joy.
That's correct. Thank you very much.
Thank you.